Hello and welcome to Foreign Policy Focus. This is episode 122 and I am the show's host Kyle. Joining me again is Will Porter. Will is an excellent writer and friend of the show. He's been on several episodes, including the episode that this episode is really going to be a continuation of, and that is our 115, The Rise of ISIS. This show is going to be focusing on the fall of ISIS. So, hey Will, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Kyle. Thank you for having me on. How are you?
I'm doing well. On the last show, really covered the rise of ISIS, and that's was who ISIS was and what was going on with ISIS as they were kind of gaining power. I would say if you haven't listened to that episode, again, Foreign Policy Focus 115, I would go back and do that if you're not super familiar with the whole bad story of ISIS. If you are, up to date on foreign policy and everything, then you may not need to go back. But this is like two-part series, so if you maybe go back and listen to it. All right, well, we're going to start this one off with kind of a bridge between the two, and that's what life was like under ISIS for the people living there. One of the things that was really highlighted about ISIS was just how brutal the ISIS guys were. So tell us a little bit about that, Will.
Yeah, as you can imagine, life under the Islamic State was not a very pleasant time for most civilians. I think even civilians who probably agreed with their ideology probably didn't have a great time living under them either. And I don't even know if I can fully capture the horror in just a brief description, but I can at least run down some of the common experiences that seem to, people seem to experience this in several different cities. So in Mosul, for example, which we've talked about at length in this show, citizens in ISIS-held areas weren't allowed to leave. They're basically kept there to be used as human shields. And in more ways than one. So, some civilians were actually put in front of windows where they were forced to stand as a literal human shield. And there's also just, ISIS wanted a lot of civilians in the area just so they could hide within the crowds of them, and kind of force the coalition to make tough choices about bombing civilians. Now, under these circumstances of these civilians living under ISIS control, every manner of torture and abuse took place there. That's what I mean when I say I don't know if I can even recount all of the horrors. But in last March, reports of food shortages and starvation actually came out of cities like Mosul. And this is all due to the ISIS occupation and the wartime conditions. So civilians were facing starvation in some of these cities. However, people trapped in ISIS territory, they weren't only terrorized by the militant group itself. In a lot of these cities, they also faced a relentless American bombing campaign where, thousands of civilians have been killed in that, as well as overzealous Iraqi soldiers who didn't always discriminate between average Sunni citizens and genuine ISIS members. In Mosul, the U.S. air campaign caused indescribable devastation to the city's infrastructure, and Iraqi special forces had been reported to be torturing people. So civilians in ISIS-held areas were basically under fire from all sides, from every party to the conflict.
Yeah, and the other thing I would add is just kind of the form of Islamic law that ISIS applied to the citizens that were forced to live under ISIS was pretty brutal. I know that at times people weren't allowed to have cell phones, smoking was prohibited, women were, forced to wear, I think, pretty, the full burqas. And so all of this kind of contributes to the idea of the people in the ISIS prisons weren't necessarily guilty criminals. I know a few times during the bombings, prisons were hit and they were kind of labeled as, 20 prisoners were killed. But really, these were likely 20 pretty innocent civilians.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, ISIS is known for their summary executions, for cutting people's hands off, and like you said, preventing smoking and drinking, and all. They're totalitarians. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Will, at the peak of ISIS, I think their kind of most important position was the city of Mosul, including controlling the Mosul Dam. So this is where we, start to have some of the first warnings against how dangerous ISIS is and how dangerous they could be. So why don't we start here with the fall of ISIS and just talking a little bit about Mosul and what happened there.
Right, the Mosul Dam, yeah, that was like a very kind of high-profile episode in the whole story of the Islamic State. And the Mosul Dam is the largest dam in Iraq. And ISIS took over that dam from the Kurdish Peshmerga in the summer of 2014, sort of at the height of their big military offensive, their blitzkrieg. And for a few weeks there, as ISIS was holding this dam, there were some alarmist observers. The more alarmist observers were sort of fearing that the group might either breach the dam on purpose to try to flood and destroy nearby areas downstream, or simply that the group would just mismanage it and sort of having the same result of the dam breaking. And a lot of these concerns came from the fact that the Mosul dam was really rickety and falling apart for years before this. But either way, a breach of the dam was never that likely, but that was just one of the more extreme fears of what could have happened. However, control of that dam would have given ISIS the ability to manipulate the power supply of neighboring Iraqi cities. And so that's why the Iraqi military and Kurdish militias, supported by American air power, they retook the dam just a few weeks after ISIS captured it. But it was sort of like a significant episode, like I said, sort of showing like, wow, this group really can take territory and hold it. They even have control of this dam.
Great. And so as the battle for Mosul moves on, the United States starts destroying key infrastructure. Why don't you talk a little bit about this?
Sure. Yeah, in addition to the dam being sort of in rickety condition, that's a big important infrastructure in Mosul. At one point, in the later stages of the battle in Mosul, every major bridge in the city had been completely destroyed, which left one single like rickety pontoon bridge as like the only route of escape, or only route in and out of the old city of Mosul, which is extremely densely populated. And this sort of just like further highlights the situation of the residents living under ISIS in that city. They had almost no escape and very few options. Now, earlier on in the battle to retake that city, hundreds of thousands of citizens did find a way to flee, but I think that was when the bridges were still largely intact. Like later on, people were pretty much trapped in the city because of the great destruction of roads and bridges.
Jumping ahead of the loss of some other cities, let's finish up, kind of what happened in Mosul. When the bombing started, the civilians were told to stay in place, and this seemed to be a pretty significant development. So tell us the importance of this order.
Yeah. Even as late as March of this year, the Iraqi government was urging citizens in Mosul not to flee. And as I had already said, hundreds of thousands had already done so, but there were still thousands left in the city. And in some ways, like this kind of makes sense because, when you're trying to conduct a military campaign, having thousands of fleeing civilians in the roads and streets and stuff, you can imagine that would probably complicate the situation. However, this still had some pretty devastating consequences for people living in Mosul. Just a week after the Iraqi government made this demand, or one of their later demands in March, on March 17th, an American airstrike hit a building complex that killed between 150 and 300 people who were hiding in that building. And sort of the timing of these two incidents is hard to ignore. The American-backed Iraqi military orders civilians to stay put, and then these same civilians are killed like they're fish in a barrel by an American strike. And this raised a lot of questions about sort of the indiscriminate nature of American targeting in Mosul, which, as I said, was already a very densely populated city. The coalition would investigate that March 17th strike and find that they killed 100 people, but they tried to blame the deaths on ISIS. And maybe that's because they were partially involved in telling the citizens to stay put in the first place. I'm not sure.
And so what was kind of the I guess, totality of what happened to Mosul? Just total destruction of the city, and maybe how many people estimated killed?
Yeah, as you said, absolute devastation of the city's infrastructure, of its roads and bridges, etc. However, according to a recent report, the total death toll in Mosul from the Mosul siege, which lasted about 9 months, could be as high as 40,000 people. And that number is much higher than a lot of previous estimates have put it. And this number comes from a reporter named Patrick Coburn, who's the Middle Eastern correspondent for The Independent, which is a British paper. And Coburn talked to a former senior minister in Iraq named Hoshyar Zabari, who had seen the contents of a Kurdish intelligence report, which put the number at 40,000. Now, this 40,000 number, it's still kind of speculative. We don't know for a fact that it is 40,000, but that is that's like the higher end estimate. And it kind of remains to be seen how many people were killed in Mosul, because there's still lots of rubble and there's still lots of bodies to be cleaned out of the rubble. However, one thing, recently, the New York Times Magazine, they finished an investigation that found that civilian casualties in Mosul were way higher than probably previously counted. And this, I think, lends support to what Coburn had reported with the 40,000. In 5 of the strikes that this New York Times Magazine piece investigated, they found that civilian death tolls were 31 times higher than what the coalition had previously reported. And so that might actually support this idea of 40,000 casualties.
And then we have one more casualty of the, bombing of Mosul, and that was the destruction of the Al-Nuri Mosque. You want to tell us, kind of the importance of not only the mosque, but then the events of its destruction?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, the Al-Nuri Mosque, as you say, is another casualty. It's more of a historical casualty. This mosque was in Mosul's old city. It was built in the 12th century, and it stood for hundreds of years through all kinds of conflicts and invasions and stuff, but it did not withstand this latest conflict, unfortunately. So as we discussed on the previous show about the rise of ISIS, in the summer of 2014, after ISIS took a bunch of Iraqi cities in a big military offensive, the group declared the creation of its Islamic caliphate from the balcony of the Grand Al-Nuri Mosque. And so this mosque had a lot of symbolic importance to ISIS, because that was where they sort of initiated their caliphate. However, in June of this year, just as ISIS was sort of being forced out of Mosul by the Iraqis and the Americans, ISIS blew up the mosque to ensure it wasn't recaptured, apparently. And they tried to blame the destruction of the mosque on the United States, but no one really believes them when they say that. There's even a video that shows what seems to be the mosque's destruction, and it shows explosives were planted inside of the building. So the mosque, though, the loss of the mosque was a huge symbolic defeat for ISIS. They lost the very mosque from where the caliphate was declared.
Absolutely, and like you said, it was a 9-month siege of Mosul. I think it started in October of last year, and then the city was finally liberated right at the end of spring of this year. So while the kind of story on Mosul and then ISIS losing Mosul spans the entire fall of the Islamic State, now we're kind of going back to the beginning. So tell us how the airstrikes in Syria and then against ISIS even started.
Yeah, so the bombing initially, the United States kind of got its foothold in Syria as far as conducting military operations there, with the threat of what was called the Khorasan Group. And the Khorasan Group was said to be a cell of senior al-Qaeda leaders that were based in Syria. And this group was said to be particularly interested in attacking the United States. And so that was sort of how they were sold, that this Khorasan Group is going to carry out attacks in the West. And as you said, it was sort of one of the first groups that the U.S. had decided to target for bombing in Syria. Now, no one ever really determined whether or not such a group as the Khorasan Group existed as a separate, distinct entity from the rest of al-Qaeda. However, one of the senior leaders in Syrian al-Qaeda, Abu Muhammad al-Jawlani, insisted there was no such group. I don't know how reliable his word is there, but he said that there's no such thing. There is, however, what's called the Khorasan affiliate of the Islamic State, which is in Afghanistan. And this refers to an area around Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. And there's also something called the Khorasan Shura, which is like a leadership council within al-Qaeda, which is where the name Khorasan Group comes from. However, a lot of people some analysts believe that this Khorasan Group was merely used as a way to sort of gin up support for American bombing in Syria, by trying to convince Americans that they were threatened by this vicious Khorasan Group. And after a couple American airstrikes, a couple militants were killed that were said to belong to the group. The FBI came out and said that the group wasn't a threat anymore and that the government should focus on ISIS. And so that may have just been sort of a pretext to get a foothold in Syria with the Khorasan Group.
Right, and this is extremely important because before this, the American people actually rejected the war in Syria. Obama said he didn't have to ask for authority to go after ISIS, but he felt like he would, and the Congress ended up not acting because none of the congressmen were, brave enough to vote against it, and so, they kind of took the coward's way out by just not voting on it. Thus, Obama still has the authority because Congress didn't, vote against the war or something like that. So this move against the Khorasan Group was pretty significant because the American people had just explicitly rejected the war in Syria, and the Obama administration went through with it anyways.
Right, and they had to be told that they were under threat of some, foreign terrorist group to even get them to go along at all.
And so that was kind of how the Americans got involved in Syria. The Russians had a little bit of a different path to get involved. And while this might not have been the sole reason or even the main reason that the Russians got involved, it certainly happened right before they did. And do you want to remind us, I guess, of the terror attack of the Russian plane being downed?
Yeah, sure. And as you said, Russia had been sort of semi-involved in Syria with aiding the Assad government. But I think after this is when they really, got militarily involved operationally there. So on Halloween in 2015, a Russian commercial jet exploded as it was taking off from the Sharm el-Sheikh airport in Egypt. And everybody on board the flight was killed, which I think was like 224 people. However, the cause of this explosion was never totally verified, but the people who investigated it believe it was a bomb. It was a terrorist attack. And soon after this explosion, the Islamic State branch in Sinai in Egypt took credit for the bombing. And while nobody had ever been really caught for the attack, no one had ever really been brought to justice, a mechanic at the airport and a bag handler and 2 police officers actually in Egypt were under suspicion for the attack. And so other than Russia's increased involvement in Syria, nothing really came of this as far as arrests. ISIS took credit for it and it was kind of left there.
Thanks for reminding us of that. I think it's one thing that never gets brought up. everybody always thinks of America and their right to go overseas to kill people in like Afghanistan or Iraq because of 9/11. And here we have a similar event for Russia where one of their civilian planes gets down, at least claimed to be by the Islamic State. And so for America to oppose Russia's intervention is a little hypocritical for that reason.
Yeah, certainly. If we're still justifying our interventions based on 9/11, which is 15 years ago now, over 15 years ago, I don't know, it's a little absurd to blame Russia or to complain about them when this just happened to their plane, That was like just 2 years ago.
Absolutely. So when the U.S. Starts picking up the fight against ISIS in Iraq, the first three cities on the list are Fallujah, Tikrit, and Ramadi. Why don't you kind of tell us how the battle goes there?
Yeah, we can kind of just tick down some of these cities, and I'll run down some of the major details of or some of the major stories that emerge from these conflicts. So, starting with Fallujah, parts of that city were first captured actually much earlier on, before ISIS's like big blitzkrieg. So in January of 2014, ISIS had already begun to start taking Fallujah, cities like Fallujah and Hit. However, the ISIS, after it captured the city fully, it held onto it for a couple years, 2 years, excuse me. And after a months-long siege, the city was finally liberated around the summer of 2016. And just like in other cities that ISIS held, they prevented civilians from fleeing and imposed all kinds of authoritarian stuff on them. However, once ISIS was sort of dislodged from Fallujah, the U.S. and the Iraqi Air Forces pretty much just slaughtered hundreds of ISIS fighters as they attempted to escape. As they rode along the desert roads, they just strafed them and killed a bunch of them. And we'll see later that the U.S. didn't do that in various cases in Syria. So it's strange where they decide to bomb the fleeing ISIS guys and when they don't. However, the fall of Fallujah, the liberation of Fallujah, I should say, was seen as a pretty symbolic thing, as it was one of their, behind Mosul, Fallujah was one of the largest cities they held in Iraq. And so moving on to Tikrit, which is a north-central city in Iraq, this was taken by ISIS in June of 2014, and this is sort of as part of their initial their surge. And so on June 11th, Tikrit fell to ISIS, and the very next day, between 1,000 and 1,500 Iraqi Air Force cadets were taken hostage, and they were massacred en masse outside of one of Saddam's old palaces. And this was like a major war crime. It was one of the most egregious acts carried out by ISIS during their campaign in Iraq, where they just slaughtered thousands of people. And Tikrit would be liberated in March of the next year in 2015. However, one of the largest stories out of that was the massacre. Now, finally, going to Ramadi, which is a city that fell a little bit later. It fell in May of 2015, under the cover of a sandstorm, actually. ISIS marched in, where the Americans couldn't really see them. So before the city was liberated in February of 2016 by the Iraqi army, it was completely destroyed in fighting. Ramadi is completely disintegrated. A month after Ramadi was liberated, the UN actually issued an assessment that said that the destruction in Ramadi was worse than anywhere in Iraq at the time. Some 6,000 buildings were damaged and 2,000 were destroyed. And that includes the city's main hospital, its train station, 64 of its bridges, and a lot of its electrical grid. And at the time, a local official told the press that all water, electricity, sewage, and other infrastructure had been damaged to some degree in the city. And so, Ramadi was almost completely flattened to the ground in the fighting.
So, and then this is kind of, these three cities are, if you're going Baghdad, kind of going north in Iraq towards Mosul. At the same time, ISIS is kind of moving from Mosul outwards, either north or east, and they run here into the Kurds and the Kurdistan regional government. So, Will, tell us how this conflict plays out.
Yeah, sure. As you say, ISIS was making gains in the north, in the Kurdish region of Iraq, where the KRG is, the Kurdish regional governorate, Kurdistan regional governorate. And ISIS did capture a lot of territory in their initial blitzkrieg, but the Kurds took back a lot of that territory in Iraq's north pretty quickly. And this includes the oil-rich town of Kirkuk. And so, focusing a bit on Kirkuk, since 2014, the Kurdish Peshmerga had occupied the town after they took it from ISIS. The Kurdish government had plans to incorporate this city and basically annex it into a Kurdish state. And this is a big deal because Kirkuk it's an ethnically mixed city. It's not all Kurds. There's Arabs and other minorities there. And it's, like I say, it has a lot of oil. And so this kind of set off a conflict between the Kurds and the Iraqi government. In the Kurds taking territory from ISIS, it kind of led to some disagreements with the government in Baghdad. So in the middle of October, just recently, the Iraqi military actually they marched onto Kirkuk, and as well as other Kurdish-occupied areas, and kind of tried to make sure the Kurds didn't do a land grab, as they were trying to do with Kirkuk. And the most interesting part of this, I think, is that the Kurdish militiamen in Kirkuk were said to have stood down and offered no resistance at all. And some people speculate that a deal may have been reached between the Iraqi government and particular faction of Kurds that's opposed to the Kurdish leader Masoud Barzani. And so this is just it's a side issue, but it's fascinating how the Kurds taking territory from ISIS has led to so much conflict with the Iraqi government.
Right, and that's, I'm sure one thing we'll talk about at the end is just how, as ISIS loses its caliphate, it sets up additional conflicts. A lot of analysts, including Patrick Coburn, I know, kind of predicted that these conflicts will come sooner. But as the caliphate dies, I think we'll see more and more as, Will tells the story, that the other factions come into conflict. Moving next on to the Mount Sinjar story. This was a pretty significant note in American media. So why don't what happened here?
Sure, and I think this situation was sort of similar. It's sort of used as similar to the Khorasan group. I think this was kind of used as a pretext to push for more American intervention in Iraq. And so in August of 2014, as part of the big ISIS offensive, it stormed the northern city of Sinjar. And according to local officials in Sinjar, ISIS, their whole goal in Sinjar was it was a demographic goal. They were trying to sort of Arabize the area and push out non-Arab ethnicities. And that included Kurds and Yazidis. And in the case of the Yazidis, which is a particular ethnic faction, ISIS would abduct and kill thousands of men and women from the Yazidi tribes. And a lot of these women were forced into chattel slavery. So it was just a terrible situation. And 50,000 or so Yazidis would be trapped on the Sinjar mountain. However, within a few days, Kurdish fighters were able to help evacuate them into safety and save them, basically. And that was with help of American air support, apparently. And so Sinjar would be retaken by ISIS, Sinjar would be retaken from ISIS by American-backed Kurds a few months later. But yeah, this whole situation with the Yazidis and the slavery and them being stuck on Mount Sinjar, that was sort of used as a pretext for heavier American involvement.
Yeah, that was a really interesting note and a really interesting story kind of as this develops, a very important one. Another story that gained some media attention was Palmyra. While the media focused mainly on the destruction of the ancient artifacts there, the more interesting, the more important story is how the U.S. played a role in ISIS's capture and recapture of the city.
Yeah. So moving to Syria and Palmyra, when the Islamic State first captured the city in 2015, at this time, other rebel groups were then launching a big offensive in the north around Idlib and Aleppo. And among these other rebel groups were Islamist groups such as al-Nusra, which is the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate we've discussed in the show. And also among those rebels were a lot of American-backed, quote-unquote, moderate rebels, who at the time who were armed to the teeth with foreign weapons and ammunition and other aid. And so by helping to boost up this rebel offensive in the north, this basically helped to tie up the Syrian army and pull them away from Palmyra. And at this very same time, the American government halted its airstrikes on ISIS, and it basically allowed them to march right into Palmyra and just take the city. And if you'll bear with me, a quote from the New York Times actually puts this very starkly. It says, quote, "Any airstrikes against Islamic State militants in and around Palmyra would probably benefit the forces of President Bashar al-Assad. So far, United States-led airstrikes in Syria have largely focused on areas far outside of government control to avoid the perception of aiding a leader whose ouster President Obama has called for." And so basically by beefing up this rebel opposition and selectively deciding to stop our bombing, we helped ISIS take Palmyra, indirectly or directly, however you want to look at it. Palmyra was fortunately liberated this March, and the city traded hands between ISIS and the Syrian government for a while, but I think it's finally liberated.
Yeah, I think after it was taken and then the Russians helped drive them out again, but the bombing there, especially by the Syrian government in Russia, was particularly devastating. And while we will highlight a lot of the American airstrikes against ISIS, Russia and Syria have bombed very brutally as well.
Yeah, no question. No doubt.
So enter into more players into the whole ISIS war. In northern Syria, we have the towns of Manbij and Al-Bab, and these draw in Syrian Kurdish fighters, Turkey, and then other rebels. So tell us about the loss of these cities and how the geopolitics play out.
Yeah, this was another important episode, I think, in American involvement, too, as we'll see. So a lot happened in and around the city of Manbij earlier this year. After American-backed Kurdish forces took the city from ISIS in the summer of 2016, about a year later, Turkey would send in troops to capture a nearby city called Al-Bab. And both of these cities are far in the north of Syria, like near the Syrian-Turkish border. Now, Turkey's part in this whole conflict has mostly been they're trying to deter Kurdish gains in the north of Syria, again, along the Syrian-Turkish border. Though in doing this, in trying to prevent Kurdish gains, this has meant taking territory from ISIS and kind of holding it. So after Turkey took Al-Bab, it threatened to actually march on the city of Manbij, which made clashes with the Kurds who were stationed there pretty likely. So in response to this, the Americans actually sent in ground troops to embed with the Kurdish militias in Manbij. And this was actually one of the first reported cases of regular non-special forces American troops being stationed in Syria. And I think the situation with the Turks and the Kurds was sort of used as a pretext. It's a common theme here, is finding pretexts to get more involved.
Absolutely. And right now, so as you're kind of setting that up, the Turks threatened to march on the city that was held by the Kurds. What the Americans are doing is they have Humvees, and they put huge American flags on the back of them, and they drive in between the lines, the Kurdish and the Turkish lines, to make sure nobody gets close enough to shoot at each other. But in the meantime, they actually get shot at from time to time. So I know I've heard people talk about Afghanistan, say the troops don't believe in the mission. And I remember seeing all those posts like on Reddit and stuff where you have the U.S. soldiers saying, I didn't, sign up to fight for ISIS or whatever. I can't imagine how these troops must feel that are literally human shields between two U.S. allies as we try to carefully negotiate this situation in Syria.
Absolutely.
After the loss of Manbij and Al-Bab, we have the Syrian Arab Army kind of makes a campaign through the Syrian desert and bumps up against the United States here as they look to take territory from ISIS. Fill us in on this part of the story.
Yeah, over the summer, this is primarily over the summer, the Syrian Arab Army and its sort of allied militia groups, I think it was mostly the militia groups making its way through the south, through the desert. But Assad's forces were making a lot of gains through the desert in the south. And their goal, I think, was eventually to move eastward toward Raqqa and the province, the sort of the countryside. And at this time, people were describing a race for Raqqa. Analysts were talking about a race for Raqqa between the American-backed forces and the Assad-backed forces. And I'm not sure if we've mentioned this, but Raqqa at this time was known as the capital city of the ISIS caliphate. So it was a big deal to try to capture this thing. Now, while the Syrian army made a lot of progress in this period, the United States put a lot of obstacles in front of them and their operations against the Islamic State. And so just over a period of a couple weeks, in 3 separate instances, American planes actually struck Syrian allied militias as they were attempting to maneuver in an area in the south. And this is the reason the Americans bombed them was because it was nearby an American garrison, which should be noted, the Syrians and the Russians and their allies consider this garrison to be illegal. And so Assad allied troops were maneuvering near this garrison, and in response, the United States bombed them. And it seemed to be without provocation. The Syrian militias were not marching on the garrison; they were just maneuvering nearby. Now, last June, those clashes, these bombings, actually culminated in an incident over a city that's a little bit further to the north called Tabqa, and this is where an American warplane was actually shot down a Syrian jet. And this could have been way worse, but fortunately it did not lead to any kind of further escalations in the conflict between the Americans and Assad. But it was a pretty clear-cut example of how the American presence in Syria and its refusal to cooperate with Assad and the Russians, it risks, greater conflict, a more serious conflict. And at the same time, it makes fighting the Islamic State way more complicated. It makes it way more messy.
Yeah, and another pretty clear-cut example of this is when we have the surrender of ISIS fighters on the Syrian-Lebanon border. Those fighters surrendered, and this was, I think, in September. Those fighters surrendered, and the Syrian government granted them free passage to the Deir ez-Zor province of Syria. The United States said they don't accept the terms of the surrender and carried out airstrikes to prevent this convoy of buses from reaching the Deir ez-Zor province and stranded them out in the middle of the Syrian desert. So it's just amazing how the United States, just tries to control all these little details. Of course, Assad had adopted kind of a policy against Syrian rebels of, surrounding and then besieging a town and then allowing them free passage into the Idlib province. So I'm guessing that was kind of the same strategy he was trying here, is, trying to cut down on civilian casualties by, rather than just bombing the last couple of square blocks held by ISIS, allowing them to go across the country. While this is going on, the U.S. starts their campaign to retake ISIS. They backed the SDF to do that. So tell us a little bit about the SDF and what goes on here.
Sure, yeah. So the city of Raqqa, this is the ISIS, the caliphate's capital city. ISIS lost control of the city fairly recently. This is just in the middle of October. And this is a huge deal, as I said, because of its status as the capital city. And next to the liberation of Mosul, Raqqa is probably the clearest milestone in the demise of the Islamic State. And as you said, the liberation of the city was done mostly by a group called the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a multi-ethnic faction. It's mostly made up of Kurds, and it's backed by American assistance and air power. However, at one point in Raqqa, just before the SDF victory, and this is regarding surrender of the Islamic State, members of ISIS were beginning to surrender to the Kurds, and specifically to the Kurds because the Kurds were the least likely to execute them after they surrendered. And as this was happening, as ISIS guys were trying to surrender, a couple Western officials came out. I believe it was a French and American official, suggesting that it would be preferable just to kill the remaining ISIS fighters instead of letting them surrender. And even the Secretary of Defense talked about annihilation tactics, and he explicitly stated the intention of not allowing foreign fighters to leave Syria alive and return to their home countries. Nevertheless, though, despite these quotes from these officials, a deal was made between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the Islamic State to allow about 4,000 people to be evacuated from Raqqa in a convoy of trucks. And this was about 250 ISIS fighters, and the rest of the 4,000 was their family members. Now, everyone involved in this little deal to allow ISIS to surrender, they wanted to keep this secret, but the BBC actually got the story and wrote a report on it. So these fighters, these 250 ISIS fighters, which included foreign fighters, despite what James Mattis said, these guys were allowed to flee the country with their weapons, their ammunition, and their explosives, and they were allowed to flee into further east in Syria, where they still control a little bit of territory. Now, as you said, this deal is not completely unique. The Assad government has struck deals with rebels to let them leave elsewhere in Syria. Like in May, there was a deal in Homs that allowed thousands of rebels and their family members to flee with their rifles. So it's not completely different from Assad's strategy of allowing it to happen. But nonetheless, we did still let 250 insurgents on the loose. And at least one of those insurgents included a high-ranking ISIS intelligence chief named Abu Musad Hutaifa. And he was on one of these truck convoys. So yeah, I mean, you can be critical about allowing these insurgents to flee, but as you also kind of alluded to, allowing them to leave probably saved some lives in the city, and it may have even contributed to making the siege in Raqqa shorter than the one in Mosul, just because they were actually allowed to surrender and not just, annihilated.
Right, and then what about the civilian toll and just kind of overall destruction of Raqqa?
Yeah, according to a group called AirWars, which is a group that monitors war casualties, 1,300 civilians were killed by coalition strikes in Raqqa. And local monitors in the area estimate that another 500 were killed by the Islamic State. But again, similar to Mosul, I think a lot of bodies are still buried in the rubble, so it remains to be seen really what the total death toll will be. And similar to Mosul, civilians faced all the same horrors. They weren't allowed to leave. They were used as human shields. There was a lot of deprivation caused by the war, and they were caught in the crossfire between ISIS and all of its enemies. And so the civilians in Raqqa faced, they had the plight of many civilians in ISIS-occupied cities. And even ISIS family members and civilians, there's some pretty grisly footage that's come out of Raqqa near the final stages of the fighting. And it just shows American airstrikes on buildings, and you can hear the screams, and it's really mortifying. And the UN even came out to condemn this over the summer when the operation was just getting going to retake the city. The UN came out to condemn the indiscriminate American attacks and the airstrikes.
Okay, so now just saying the stage again, with the loss of Raqqa, ISIS really only controls the Deir ez-Zor province of Syria. At this point, they've also lost Tel Afar in Iraq. The United States is kind of operating a cleanup mission in the Anbar province of Iraq, leaving ISIS with a few pockets in the Syrian desert, but really only the Deir ez-Zor province. So tell us about the loss of that province for ISIS.
Yeah, and in September, the Syrian Arab army began to push into the area surrounding the city of Deir ez-Zor. And this is often something that has to happen before operations to retake a city happen. They have to secure the sort of surrounding area, which is a lot of territory to cover. Now, ISIS had actually controlled the surrounding province in Deir ez-Zor for a while, but a portion of the city itself has always had stayed in Syrian hands. And so the Syrian government had some foothold there. But they're just now beginning to push in and take the city from ISIS. And the thing about Deir ez-Zor and the surrounding areas is that they're fairly oil rich, and there's a lot of oil resources in this region. And so a lot of the fighting in this region of Syria has come down to not only taking cities and towns, but also oil fields. Now, just last month, actually, the American-backed forces, the Syrian Democratic Forces, captured the Al Omar oil field, which is the largest in Syria. And it's kind of weird because the Syrian army is stationed just a few miles away on the other side of the Euphrates River, and the American forces are currently holding the largest oil field in Syria. So we're gonna have to see how that pans out there. But yeah, so Deir ez-Zor has been important mostly because of the oil in the surrounding areas.
Right, and then with the fall of the city, ISIS no longer controls Deir ez-Zor city. They've lost the surrounding oil fields and gas fields. So that's all their income. They've lost the border towns now on the Syrian-Iraq border near Deir ez-Zor, and that pretty much does it. The caliphate is now gone. So, Will, we have, the death of the caliphate?
I mean, it appears to be, at least this stage of it, like, we just ran down pretty much all the major cities they held, and they've now lost them. So yeah, after about 3 years or so of fighting, it looks like the Islamic State is on its last leg, but only as a territory-controlling organization, like as a quasi-state. The group controls a dwindling little slice of territory in the barren Syrian desert in the far east of the country. In western Iraq, the situation is similar. They control a bunch of barren, desert, sparsely populated territory. But I don't think this is going to be the last that we actually hear of the Islamic State. And I can only guess that the next stage of this group and their development, they'll be given a different name by the government and the media to kind of obscure the fact that they never went away. But I mean, ISIS started, as we described in the prior episode, the rise of ISIS. This group started as a jihadist insurgency. It didn't start as a state. And so it almost certainly is going to revert back to being a typical, jihadist insurgency, more along the lines of like regular Al-Qaeda. And I also expect that the presence of this insurgency is going to be used by the Americans to stay occupying in Iraq and Syria longer. At least in Iraq, though, we have permission from the central government, whereas in Syria, it's the opposite. The Russians and the Iranians and the Syrians all say that American presence there is unwanted and illegal. But I suspect that whatever ISIS turns into, it's not going to go away, and it's going to be used as a pretext to stay longer. Now, also in the previous episode, we talked about the strategy of groups like the Islamic State versus groups like Al-Qaeda and bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri's strategy. Now, we might actually look at the case of the Islamic State as a total failure of the group's near-enemy strategy, where they wanted to take on local Arab states before they took on the West. And so, Osama bin Laden's, his entire reason for wanting to push the West out of the Middle East first was precisely this, that he thought the West would never tolerate a caliphate in the region. And in some ways, it seems like bin Laden was actually right about this. ISIS tried to start the caliphate, and the West bombed them out of existence. This isn't to say the West hasn't done had its own share in fomenting extremism and even ISIS itself in the region. But certainly we can't deny that the coalition has bombed the Islamic State out of these cities. And so, yeah, I tend to think the sort of the vestiges, whatever's left of the Islamic State, that's going to be used. It's going to set the stage for the next series of conflicts in the Middle East, in Syria. The American occupation there is not going to stop. And so, just as we've seen in the last 15 years or so of American foreign policy, one intervention begets the next intervention. One conflict leads to the next conflict, and that's kind of what I expect to happen here.
Absolutely. The United States has announced their intentions to stay both in Iraq and Syria for years to come. I saw yesterday, I was looking at the Twitter account for whatever military operation the United States has against ISIS right now, and they're posting pictures and videos of them training Iraqi soldiers. And I was like, they just, announced that they defeated ISIS in Iraq, so why are they training Iraq? Who are they training the Iraqi soldiers to shoot at? And so, while the Islamic Caliphate itself is dead, ISIS as a group or as an insurgency is probably not done. The jihadists will again, carry out attacks in various places around Syria, Iraq, the Middle East, and North Africa, or even Eastern Asia, as we saw in the Philippines. And so, we have more of this kind of stuff to come, so long as we have the continued U.S. interventionism and support for Saudi Arabia and all those other terrible policies that lead to all these terrorists.
Indeed.
Will, do you have it? Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask if you had any other thoughts. So share your thoughts, man.
Oh, yeah. I was just going to say that, we should all celebrate the fact that the Islamic State has been kicked out of all these territories. Like, I don't want to be too much of a negative Nancy about it, but we shouldn't be overly optimistic about what's going to happen with this group. Just because the American government declared victory over it, like, we've seen that happen before, right? Mission accomplished. So we should maybe keep our optimism in check about, what's happening with the Islamic State.
Right. And we should also, keep our expectations checked as, what's to come in Syria and Iraq. Just because ISIS is defeated does not mean those conflicts are over. And now we have a situation in Syria where we have Assad, kind of still saying that Syria is going to be united and, he plans to control all of Syria. And then the United States says they plan on staying in SDF territory, which seems to one day mean that there's going to be, Syrian soldiers shooting at American soldiers. And in northern Syria, we have Turkey insisting that the Kurds can't be, west of the Euphrates? And in southern Syria, we have Israel saying that, they're going to protect some of the Syrian rebels on the border there. So it's absolutely crazy. And, the kind of vacuum that ISIS left has been filled by a whole bunch of powers who are still vying to control all of it. All right, Will, do you have anything you would like to plug or anywhere to send people now that we've finished up our two-part series on the rise and fall of ISIS?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can send you to some of my writing. You can find some of my freelance work at the Libertarian Institute at the blog, and as well as at the Viewpoint section of antiwar.com. It's been a minute since I've contributed to either of those, but you can still find my stuff. As well as there's a site called The Daily Sheeple that over the summer I wrote a lot of news and commentary for. And my Twitter handle is WKP_ANCAP, ANCAP. And I think that's it.
All right. And just like Will Porter, you can find my work and this podcast at thelibertarianinstitute.org. The podcast can be found at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. The Facebook page is the Libertarian Union. Check that out. Tons of great libertarian shows there. Twitter handle is at KYAAALE. And thank you so much for tuning in.
Thanks, Kyle.